Good morning and welcome to our worship service today. This is Sunday morning, although you might have noticed it looks a little darker in the sanctuary because this is really being recorded in the evening. But this is the use for the first time of our new camera that eventually will be giving us live streaming. So we're thankful to all of those who've had a part in making that happen and making it possible. I like Presbyterians. My grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, even though I didn't get to know him. My son is a member of a Presbyterian church. But I have to admit to you that I have some difficulty with Calvinism. When we're talking about predestination and God's foreknowledge, that gets a little bit confusing. In my last church in Delaware, I always had some students from a Presbyterian church in particular who would come and take part in the service, and they were a great addition to our congregation. But every Sunday after the service, somebody would say to me, "That was a good sermon and we appreciated it, Pastor, but tell us, do you believe in predestination, Calvinism, or do you believe in free will?" My answer was, yes, I actually believe in both. That causes some looks of horror on some faces, and they would say, well, you can't believe in both, you have to choose one or the other. And my question always is, why? The New Testament clearly teaches both. Even if I don't understand them, I tend to believe in both of them. There's a historic story about the ultra-Calvinist who fell down a flight of stairs. When he got to the bottom, he had broken his leg. But he jumped up and shouted out, "Thank God, that's over." Well, that's a little bit ultra for me as well. I do have a solution for the confusion of Calvinism or free will, and I'll share that with you toward the end of the message, if that's all right. Remember that even after this long introduction, we're really talking today, the sermon is about Paul's final trip, his trip to Rome, and his shipwreck experience, and his thanksgiving. This also gives us, again, the we passages in the book of Acts, where Luke has once again joined with Paul and some of the others, and is there as an eyewitness to what he's recording for us. It's been over 2 years now since Jesus said to Paul, "You are going to get to go to Rome." Now, finally, Paul is on his way. And we're going to look at 3 scenes of his experiences as we look at today's message. The first one is before the storm, or we see Paul speaking. In chapter 27, let's read just the first 2 verses. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. We boarded a ship from Adramyttium, about to sail for ports along the coast of the province of Asia, and we put out to sea. Aristarchus, a Macedonian from Thessalonica, was with us. And the us includes Luke, the physician, who was there as Paul's amanuensis. Remember that Paul had spent or wasted 2 years of his life as a guest of the governor Felix. He was in Caesarea Maritima, and it must have been a weary time for him. The only people he got to preach to or to talk to were the guests who came to Felix's house and when he wanted to put him on display. When Festus took over as governor, he also toyed with Paul and used him mostly for entertainment. This was extremely frustrating for Paul, and finally being pushed by Festus, he appealed to Caesar. He appealed to Rome, which was his right as a Roman citizen. Now, Festus was required to honor Paul's request, even though he declared that it probably was unnecessary, that he probably could have set Paul free. There weren't any serious charges against him. But since he had appealed to Caesar, to Rome he must go. Festus had to honor that request. So the plans were made, all of the ship schedules were checked, and finally Paul was now loading on a ship and heading for Rome. Imagine his excitement. His lifetime dream was finally coming true. There was another centurion. His name was Julius, another good centurion, we noticed in the New Testament. And he was assigned to accompany Paul, or at least to guard him on his journey to make sure that he arrived safely in Rome. We don't know how many men the centurion brought with him, how many soldiers there were on board the ship, but there were probably several. This was a large traveling team. Later on, when they counted noses, they said there were 276 people aboard, probably all men. They changed ships one time, but unfortunately they had several unfriendly winds. They finally got to the island of Crete, out west of where they had set sail, and they were in Fair Haven, which was a port that they could have stayed in for a while. And Paul had said to the ship captain and to the centurion, I don't think we ought to go on. Now, we don't know if this was Paul's natural fear, whether it was his understanding as an experienced sailor, whether he had a premonition or a dream, or whether God appeared to him. All we know is he suggested that they wait out the winter, because it was wintertime now and dangerous to be out on the sea, rather than heading on to Rome. Julius, the centurion, however, listened to the money people. He listened to the captain of the ship, and the owner was also on board, and they wanted to get going. So they set sail again. There are times, Paul helps us to understand, when we need to speak up. We need to let others know what our opinion is. We need to know when there are other options. The church needs to have our input at times, not for our sight after something has happened and you say, I told you so, but trying to help in the process of discerning God's will for the church. Next, we see Paul during the storm. Here in chapter 27, I want to read 3 short paragraphs, something of the narrative of what was happening while they were aboard this ship. Beginning at verse 13. When a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity, so they weighed anchor and sailed along the shore of Crete. Before very long, a wind of hurricane force, called the northeaster, swept down from the island. The ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind, so we gave way to it and were driven along. As we passed to the lee of a small island called Cauda, we were hardly able to make the lifeboat secure. And verse 21. After they had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of the Lord, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. And verse 29. Fearing that we would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for daylight. In an attempt to escape from the ship, the sailors let the lifeboat down into the sea, pretending that they were going to lower some anchors from the bow. Then Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, "Unless these men stay with the ship, you cannot be saved." So the soldiers cut the ropes that held the lifeboat and let it drift away. Here we see Paul during the storm. The storm they were expecting was bad. It was furious. It was with hurricane force. It wreaked havoc on their ship, and this was not a small rowboat. Remember, 276 people aboard. Luke says that this was no small tempest. They began to lighten their load. They threw everything overboard that they could get rid of. They used some ropes to gird around the ship itself, tie it together. Men even gave up hope on ever being saved. Paul spoke up and couldn't help himself. He said, "I told you so. You disobeyed God, but hold on because there is hope. God told me last night you would all be saved even though the ship will be lost." After 2 more weeks of fighting that storm, they finally saw land. Paul said, "I knew it. I trusted God." Some tried to save themselves by sneaking off board, by using the rowboat, but Paul stopped them, and the soldiers listened to him this time. They scuttled the lifeboat and were told they had to stay with the ship. Paul was so confident at this point, he said, "You need to take some food." Can you imagine eating food after 2 weeks in a storm with no control over your ship? I have to tell you, I don't necessarily like this story. Even though I know the end of the story, I get somewhat seasick just reading about it. This is a horrible part of Paul's life and experience. But Paul, listening to his God, was a Christian voice in the midst of a storm. And the question is, how are we in a storm? How do we handle things? How do we use our voice to point toward God and to give him the credit for all of his blessings? How are we in the midst of a pandemic like today? Finally, we see Paul after the storm. We see this in the end of chapter 27, beginning our reading at verse 41. "But the ship struck a sandbar and ran aground. The bow stuck fast and would not move. The stern was broken to pieces by the pounding of the surf. The soldiers planned to swim away, escaping, but the centurion wanted to spare Paul's life and kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. The rest were to get there on planks or on other pieces of the ship. In this way, everyone reached land safely. When they ran aground, as Paul had predicted they would have to do, they ordered everybody to get off as quickly as they could as the ship was breaking up, as you can see in this picture. And apparently, on board ship, there were some other Roman prisoners, because the soldiers attached to the centurion said, "We need to kill these prisoners because we're responsible for them. We can't let them escape." Paul begged for their lives, himself included. And this time, the centurion listened to Paul and rescued him and all the other prisoners. "There'll be no killing on board this ship," he told them. Paul must have been getting used to the help of centurions by now. This had become a regular habit in his life. Everyone was saved as Paul had promised. God had told him. What do you think they thought about Paul by this time on board? Just a troublemaker? Just a loud babbler? No. Everything Paul had told them has come true. And they were safe. They found themselves on the island of Malta. And then there are some fascinating stories that follow if you've read the rest of the chapter. You know that Paul was helping gather firewood when he was bitten by a snake. It was a poisonous snake, but Paul just shook it off into the fire. He helped in the healing of one of the natives' father, and great stories circulated among the people there because of what had happened. The one thing Luke doesn't tell us in this story in Acts is what happened after all of these incidents. What kind of audience Paul had now? Can you imagine them gathering around him, around the fire perhaps, and saying, "We have heard you talk about this God who's helped you and saved you and saved us. We need to know more. Tell us about your God." Can you imagine Paul preaching that sermon, or maybe several sermons? Because they stayed there for 3 months. They did their wintering here rather than back in Crete, as Paul had recommended to them. I wonder how much thanksgiving Paul gave that day. After these 3 months, he finally did go and arrived in Rome. He thanked God for his safe deliverance. He thanked God for keeping his promises. He thanked God that he was there in Rome finally. His life's dream had come about. His was a great Thanksgiving day, wasn't it? I suspect that Paul probably signed his commitment card and put it into the cornucopia the next service he was in church. Remember the story about the tapestry? The tapestry is when we look up and see knots and loose threads hanging down from above. It looks like a jumble of nothingness, meaninglessness. But on the other side is a beautiful picture that's been woven that only God can see. That's how I see Calvinism and free will. One side is God's side. He sees a beautiful picture working out. On the underside, we see nothing but knots and loose threads and confusion, and our free will seems to run rampant. Someone years ago wisely said, "We need to work as though everything depends on us, but we need to pray as though everything depends on God." Some years ago, Sir William Ramsay, a Scottish freethinker, was commissioned by his fellow club members to go to this part of the Holy Land and trace Paul's journeys just so they could disprove the Bible. They didn't believe the Bible at all. They thought it was a made-up story, and so they sent Sir Ramsay down to prove that the story was useless and made up and didn't hold any water, and the Bible was not true. Sir Ramsay did come to this part of Asia Minor, or Turkey, in that day. He did trace the journeys of Paul, and in his studies discovered that everything that Luke recorded in the book probably happened just like he said. He was so convinced that the story was accurate and true that he became a believer. And he went back home and wrote several books during his lifetime, convincing others that Jesus was the Christ and the one that we need to listen to and to follow. How do people read our lives? When they look at us, do they think about God? Do they think about God's promises? Do they see the confidence in us that God is in charge and everything's going to work out as God has promised? May it be so with your friends and family and acquaintances, especially in these days. May others see Jesus in us. Amen and amen.